So, Wyatt, some see the summit as legitimizing Russia's position without Ukraine being present. What kind of a message does that really send to the world about diplomatic norms?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are obviously looking at what's taking place here are concerned about Ukraine's involvement. Although I will say President Trump came out this morning and said that any decisions about possible territory or land swaps would obviously have to have Ukraine at the table. So obviously, President Trump still recognizing the importance of Ukrainian independence and of Ukrainian sovereignty. Perhaps not as much as someone like Volodymyr Zelensky would like, though. Of course, he was advocating, as were many other European leaders, for Zelensky to actually be present at the meeting himself. Now, President Trump saying this meeting in Alaska is really an opportunity to get Vladimir Putin to hopefully eventually agree to a trilateral meeting between the three of them so that maybe then they can ultimately discuss, some way or some means essentially to end this conflict. But remember, this is the first time that the two have met ever since Russia escalated its invasion to a full scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So I think the fact that they're meeting is significant enough. Although Russian state media going into the meeting, they were making, taking some shots, so to speak, at the United States by saying, it's just one example that Alaska is actually a part of Russia, not the United States. So some people in the United States, I think, are a little bit concerned that maybe this meeting could go poorly. It could go perhaps maybe similar to what we saw with President Zelensky in the Oval Office here at the White House. So again, I think people are cautiously optimistic about the meeting in terms of what could come out of it. But in terms of, how likely it is to actually, from this one meeting itself, put an end to the conflict, seemingly is unlikely.
Maybe some people need to be reminded that Alaska was purchased a very long time ago. Yeah,
For 143 million, yes. Yeah.
there you go. Now, Wyatt, given Putin's history of using private meetings to really gain leverage, how concerned should we really be about the influence he could have on U.S. policy moving forward?
I mean, yeah, I think right now he definitely is in a position to kind of negotiate, so to speak, which sounds unfortunate because he is the aggressor in this conflict. Russia is certainly the aggressor in this conflict. But again, he is the one who has, greater military power, who has greater, funding power. Ukraine has a decent amount of funding, but that's because they've been receiving it from countries around the world. And so, if you're talking about it from that perspective, I think it's fair to mention that, well, it might not be, something that should be celebrated. Russia still definitely has a decent amount of leverage, or at least more than people are letting on with respect to this conflict. In terms of what they want, that's been kind of the big question throughout this conflict, because some people have been saying, like, do they want more land? Because they're already, one of the biggest countries, second biggest country in terms of land mass. Like, is it really fair to say that they want more land? And so people are questioning that. Some people say maybe it's just a power thing for Vladimir Putin as well. And so if either of those two circumstances are true, it's hard to see a world where he's doing this just to influence US policy, just because I don't really know what he would be trying to influence necessarily. I mean, certainly the United States has been a friend of Ukraine, but I wouldn't say outside of this conflict, they've been, that consequential in terms of US Ukrainian relations.
Now, if any deal is struck that pauses the war but ignores Ukraine's sovereignty, does that really risk rewarding aggression and maybe setting a dangerous precedent moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if you look at some of the other geopolitical conflicts that are happening right now overseas, that's a big concern, right? Because if you look even to the war between Israel and Hamas, that's one example of another geopolitical conflict. I will say President Trump has done some work to put some end to some conflicts. He's joked that he should nominate himself for the Nobel Peace Prize. But I mean, as much of a joke as it is, you now even have people like Hillary Clinton who have came out and said, if Donald Trump puts an end to the war in Ukraine, then sure, we can nominate him. So I think that kind of speaks to the fact that people don't actually think he himself is going to be the one to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine. Maybe he can help work with Vladimir Putin to try and calm him down a little bit. But the chances of a full-blown kind of ceasefire solely because of Donald Trump, I think, is unlikely. But yeah, I mean, you're certainly right. And it does, I think, kind of raise, a precedent that if he were to kind of bow down and if Ukraine were to bow down to the concessions and what Russia wants, it could set a dangerous precedent. So I think really you have to balance this idea of how do we put an end to the conflict without totally sacrificing their sovereignty.
So, could U.S. Russia talks like this, Wyatt, really maybe potentially weaken NATO or even split Western unity over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another thing. Vladimir Putin has said that part of the reason this conflict started was because of Ukraine's threat to join NATO, right? And so that was something that, right now they're getting a lot of support from countries within NATO, and they're not a part of NATO. So if they were a member of NATO, the support that they're receiving would be far greater, I think, as well. It's fair to say that. But yeah, I mean, I think right now a lot of the concern that's coming from the Russians is that whether it's countries like Russia, whether it's countries like Belarus, I mean, countries who have generally speaking not sided with kind of this liberal form of democracy that we know well in places like Canada, the United States, etc. Russia is trying to look for partners in this. And so when they see a country like Ukraine going against what they want and standing for democratic values, they, try and put an end to that, especially when it's geopolitically kind of closely, located next to them. So there's certainly, I think, an aspect of that. And then again, I think part of it is just Vladimir Putin's own kind of territorial ambitions. He wants to expand Russia. But again, I mean, I think he's just kind of an unpredictable figure. And so it's hard to make kind of a reasonable prognostication at this point as to what it is exactly that he's looking for.
Now, when you're talking to some of the Trump administration officials, and if they're really concerned about maybe perhaps the peace talks will fall apart between Russia and Ukraine, is there also talk and maybe reports that potentially Putin would want to reunite the USSR, not just going after Ukraine, but some of the other former states?
I mean, I think certainly the comment that he made towards Alaska is an example that he's willing to do anything. I think he, going after Ukraine, indicating that that he might rather go after Poland as well if, he is successful with his invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly what he wants to do, and I wouldn't, write off anything that he wants to do because I think right now a lot of what he's trying to do is very much in the cards for him if it wasn't for the support of, again, countries who are already in NATO, other G7 countries as well. So that's certainly part of it. But I mean, I do think that at this point in time, part of the concern really just comes down to how do we balance actually ensuring, again, as I said before, that democracy can be protected while also not allowing this conflict to go on for longer than it should.
Correspondent Wyatt Sharpe, thanks so much for joining us today from the White House.
Thank you.